A man was bleeding out on the pavement, and no one stopped. But one small girl did, using her last $5 to help him. She had no idea a powerful man was watching from the shadows, or that this one act of kindness would threaten her entire family. 3 days after, a line of black cars blocked her street, and the outcome left the whole neighborhood speechless. This is a story that proves one thing. You do not need wealth to change the world. Sometimes all it takes is $5 and the courage to care when no one else will. Stay with me until the end, because the twist in this story will leave you breathless. I enjoy seeing our global audience. Now, back to the story. At dawn, Lillian Bailey was on her knees on the cold concrete. Her tiny hands trembled as she held a water bottle and some pills. It cost her $5, the very last of her money. It was the only thing that separated her from an empty stomach that night. A few feet from her, a young man gasped for air. His knuckles were bloody, and his eyes were wide with fear. The color was draining from his face. He was failing, right on the damp sidewalk, yet the crowd flowed around him like water around a stone. A mother clutched her child's hand and whispered harshly, "Stay away. That kind is trouble." Lillian glanced from the stranger's fading eyes to the memory of the $5 bill she just gave up. She imagined her tired mother walking through the door, wondering about their next meal. Still, she could not leave him. The decision was already made. What Lillian could not have known, what no 9-year-old in a faded green coat could ever guess, was that she had just saved the son of Arthur Herman. He was the most dangerous man in the city, and in 3 days her street would be filled with his black cars. First, let me tell you about the morning before all this began. Lillian always woke up in the dark, not by choice, but because her mother's cleaning job at a downtown tower finished at 5:45 a.m. Lillian never slept deeply until she heard the key in their apartment lock. They lived on the 3rd floor of a building with unreliable heating. The air in the hall always smelled of stale carpet and other people's dinners. It was just 2 rooms and a single window that faced a brick wall. But it was home. That morning, Lillian waited on the sofa, covered in their shared blanket, staring at the front door. When it opened, her mother entered. She moved with the weariness of an old woman, her back stooped and her eyes nearly shut, carrying her work shoes. "You should be sleeping, sweetheart. I waited up." Her mother gave a faint, weary smile that said everything her tired voice could not. She sank onto the sofa next to her daughter. "Did your paycheck come?" Lillian whispered. The quiet that followed was a clear answer. Lillian pictured the kitchen. She knew its contents by heart: half a loaf of bread and some peanut butter. Eggs were a rare treat. A $5 bill could be their dinner, a bus pass, or the beginning of a week's food if they were careful. It was a fortune. Her mother placed a kiss on her hair. "Go back to sleep. I will fix us something soon." But Lillian saw the deep fatigue in her mother's expression, the slight shake in her hands as she put her bag down. She had been working for 23 hours without rest. "I can get it," Lillian offered. "I can go to the market." Her mother paused, then dug into her bag for a wrinkled $5 bill. It was all they had. Only bread and milk. "That is it." Lillian accepted the money as if it were fragile. "I promise." She put on her thin olive jacket, not nearly warm enough for the cold, and went into the hall. A light flickered above, and a door closed somewhere downstairs. The city was slowly coming to life. The street lamps cast a yellow haze in the gray morning light. The market was 3 blocks down, beyond a shuttered laundry, a closed barber shop, and an alley she knew to avoid. The frigid air stung her cheeks. She pushed her hands into her pockets. The $5 bill, a small comfort. Mr. Park owned the small store. He was an older man who rarely spoke, but he was patient, always letting her count her coins to be certain. A bell announced her arrival. "Good morning," she murmured. Mr. Park gave a slight nod, his eyes still on his paper. Lillian knew the path by heart. Bread, then milk, then the counter. She placed her items down and gave him the bill. The total was $4.62. She collected the 38 cents and change, placing it safely in her pocket. Her mother would ask for an exact count. As she stepped back into the cold air, the bag in her hand felt nearly weightless. Then her eyes found him. He was collapsed on the sidewalk near the store, leaning against a pole. He wore a dark sweatshirt and ripped jeans. A hand was clutched to his side, as if to keep himself together. Lillian hesitated. His face was badly bruised, a dark purple mark blooming on his cheek. His hands were raw and bloody. He was breathing in quick, shallow bursts. Passers-by did not seem to notice him. A woman pushing a baby. A pair of construction workers. They all continued on their way. Lillian paused, the bag hanging from her fingers, watching the man struggle to breathe. She remembered her mother's instructions. She thought of the 38 cents she had left. She saw the pale, bluish tint of the man's lips. Without another thought, she turned and re-entered the store. Mr. Park glanced up, a rare look of surprise on his face. "Did you forget an item?" Lillian placed the bread and milk back on his counter. "I have to give these back." His expression was questioning. "Please," she said, her voice soft. "I have to buy something else." Her earnest gaze must have moved him. He undid the sale without a word. Lillian took the $5 bill, her fingers shaking. She went directly to the aisle with medicine, took a bottle of water, and then a box of inexpensive pain medicine. At the front, Mr. Park calculated the new total. "Are you certain?" he asked. Lillian just nodded. It was $4.75. She gave him the money, received her change, and went back out. The man had sunk lower. His eyes were almost closed. Lillian knelt on the damp sidewalk next to him. "Hello?" she said gently. "Can you hear me?" He slowly looked at her, his gaze hazy. She opened the water. "You should drink this," she urged. He was still at first. "Please," she repeated. "You are injured." His hand trembled as he took the bottle. She helped him bring it to his mouth. He took small, difficult swallows. She opened the medicine and put 2 tablets in her hand. "Take these." Just then she heard approaching steps. They were firm and deliberate. Lillian looked up to see a man in a dark suit coming down the block. He walked quickly, with purpose. He had dark hair, no tie, and intricate tattoos covering his hands. His expression was cold and forbidding. The man next to her tensed up completely. "No," he breathed. "Not now." But the approaching figure kept his pace, and 9-year-old Lillian Bailey, with nothing but an empty bag and 38 cents, did not move an inch. Lillian Bailey knew the value of money long before she could read stories. Her education did not come from books or schoolwork. It came from necessity. Before she was 6, Lillian understood that $1.29 purchased old bread. She knew that $2.50 could get them a dozen eggs. She learned that $3.47 was the line between a meal and going to bed hungry. Her mother never intended for her to know these things. But hardship is a demanding teacher. Their small home was on the 3rd floor of a building in a constant state of disrepair. The landlord's word was as faulty as the heat. It had 2 rooms, a bathroom door that wouldn't close properly, and a kitchen so small the refrigerator door bumped the opposite wall. The carpeting was a faded, indeterminate color that was likely once much brighter. She knew her neighbors through the thin walls. Mrs. Patel's nightly arguments around 9 p.m., and the sound of game shows from Mr. Patterson's television late into the night. Yet their apartment had a luxury others like it lacked. It had a window. Though it faced the brick of another building, some mornings a narrow beam of sunlight would cut through and illuminate the spot where she studied. On those days, she felt fortunate. Her mother cleaned skyscrapers overnight, working in polished offices where executives discussed profits, oblivious to the person who cleaned their wastebaskets at 2 a.m. She earned $11.50 an hour for 35 hours of work a week. The company avoided giving her more hours because that would mean paying for benefits. After the government took its share, her mother brought home about $380 every 2 weeks after bus fare. The rent cost $850 a month. Lillian had done the math in her head, even when she tried to avoid it. The numbers would keep her up at night while she stared at the ceiling, listening to her mother's tired breathing on the mattress they shared. The figures never added up. It was impossible. But her mother always found a way. She worked extra shifts when they were available. She made their meals so thin they were barely food. She wore her shoes until the soles peeled off, and then kept wearing them for another 6 months. And she never complained. A long time ago, Lillian had learned not to ask for things. She ignored the toys and store windows. She never mentioned that her backpack was torn. She knew the $15 fee for a field trip was out of the question. She learned to say she wasn't hungry when there was only one portion of food. She would tell her teacher she had forgotten her lunch rather than admit she never had one. She had learned to make herself small and quiet because causing trouble was a luxury they could not afford. But she had also learned something more important from watching her mother. One winter night, when Lillian was 7, they were walking home in the freezing rain. Her mother was carrying 2 plastic bags in each hand filled with things from 3 different dollar stores, putting together their needs from the cheapest places. They walked past a woman sitting against the wall of a closed pharmacy. She was soaked and shivering, holding a piece of cardboard Lillian could not read in the dark. Her mother stopped. Lillian watched, confused, as her mother put down all 4 bags, rummaged in her purse, and took out a crumpled $5 bill. It was the last of her money for the next 3 days until she got paid. She pressed it into the shivering woman's hand. The woman looked up, her expression stunned. "Are you sure? Stay warm," her mother said in a quiet voice. They walked the last 4 blocks home in complete silence. That night, their dinner was just rice with butter. There were no vegetables and no meat. The cupboards were bare. Lillian asked her question cautiously, the way a child does when they already know the answer is painful. "Mama, did you need that money?" Her mother was silent for a long moment as she stirred the pot. "Yes," she finally answered, "but she needed it more. But we do not have enough. We have enough for tonight." She did not have enough for tonight. Lillian considered that for a long time. It did not make logical sense. You could not give away something you did not have. The numbers just did not work. But her mother smiled at her across their little table, looking tired and worn, but still complete, and said something Lillian would always remember. "Baby, being poor does not mean you stop being human. Sometimes the only thing we have left to give is kindness. And if we stop giving that, we have lost more than money." Lillian did not fully understand it at the time, but she never forgot it. She remembered it when kids at school made fun of her shoes, and she chose not to say anything mean about anyone else. She remembered it when she found a wallet in the park with $40 in it, and she spent 2 hours looking for the owner instead of keeping the money. She remembered it every time she had to choose between the easy way and the right way. Her mother taught her that you do not practice kindness only when you can afford it. You practice it especially when you cannot. The neighborhood where they lived had its own unwritten rules. Keep your head down. Do not make eye contact. Do not get involved. Mind your own business. Maybe then, no one would mind yours. People walked by suffering as if it was just part of the scenery. A man passed out in an alley. That was not your problem. A woman screamed for help 3 floors up. You closed your window. Someone was getting beaten up behind the liquor store. You did not see anything. This was how you survived in a place where caring could get you killed. Kindness was a liability. The smartest thing you could do was look the other way. Lillian had seen it happen 1,000 times. She saw how neighbors crossed the street to avoid one another. She saw how no one opened their door after dark. She saw that help never came unless you had money to pay for it. She watched people become smaller and colder, and she promised herself she would not be like them, even when it made no sense, even when it cost her more than she had. And that is how she found herself kneeling on a street at dawn, with her last $5 already gone, holding a water bottle for a stranger that everyone else had ignored. The young man's hand trembled as he reached for the bottle. Up close, Lillian could see how badly he was injured. His left eye was swollen, almost completely shut. The skin around it was turning a deep purple black, the kind of bruise that goes all the way to the bone. His lower lip was split, and a dark line of dried blood ran down to his chin. When he tried to adjust his position, he drew a sharp breath and pressed a hand against his ribs. Broken, he mumbled, more to himself than to her. Definitely broken. Lillian held out the pills in her palm. These will help with the pain. He looked at her, then, really seeing her. His eyes were dark blue, even with one half closed. He was young, maybe 19 or 20. Despite all the blood and bruises, there was a gentleness in his expression as he studied her. "How old are you?" he asked softly. 9. He closed his eyes. "Jesus, you should not be out here alone." "I am not alone," Lillian said, but they both knew it was a lie. "Take the pills, please." With shaking fingers, he took them from her hand and swallowed them dry, then reached for the water. He drank in small, painful sips, as if the simple act was agony. Around them, the morning was truly beginning. There were more footsteps on the sidewalk. A car passed with its radio on, too loud. Lillian heard the rattle of the metal security gate as Mr. Park opened his store, and people just kept walking past. A man in a construction vest glanced at them and then hurried away. 2 teenage girls whispered to each other. One of them pulled out her phone, not to call for help, Lillian knew, but to take a picture. An elderly woman with a shopping cart did stop, but only to say, "You are wasting your time, little girl. Boys like that get what they deserve." Lillian felt her hands clench into fists. "He needs a doctor. He needs to stay out of the trouble he gets into," the woman said, shaking her head as she pushed her cart away. The young man made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not sounded so bitter. "She is not wrong. She is wrong," Lillian said with force. "You need help. What I need is to not be here." He stopped talking abruptly, his eyes fixed on something over Lillian's shoulder. The color drained from his already pale face. "Oh no, 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 no." Lillian turned to see. The man in the black suit was much closer now, maybe half a block away. At this distance, she could see more of him. He was tall and broad, and he moved with a controlled purpose that made people get out of his way without him saying a word. His face was hard and sharp, the kind that rarely smiled. The tattoos on his hands were not random. They were intricate designs that crawled up from his knuckles and went under his sleeves. He looked dangerous. He looked like he was meant to look dangerous. "You have to go," the young man said urgently. He tried to push himself up, but gasped and collapsed back against the lamppost. "Kid, seriously, you have to get out of here, right now. But you cannot even stand. That does not matter." His voice was cracking. When he gets here, you need to be gone, far away from me. Who is he? The young man looked at her, and for the first time, Lillian saw something in his eyes that was scarier than the approaching man. It was resignation, the look of someone who had already accepted their fate. Someone I disappointed, he said quietly. The man in the black suit was 30 feet away, then 20 feet. Lillian could hear his steady, unhurried footsteps on the pavement. She should have run. Every survival instinct her mother had taught her screamed at her to drop the water bottle and go home, to lock the door, to pretend she had never seen any of it. But she thought about the woman in the rain and the $5 bill her mother could not afford to give away. Being poor does not mean you stop being human. Lillian stayed right where she was, 10 feet away. She could see the man's face clearly now. He was older than she had thought, maybe 40, with lines around his eyes and gray hair mixed in with the black. His expression was impossible to read, cold and controlled in a way that made Lillian's stomach churn. 5 feet. The young man beside her was now shaking. Lillian could not tell if it was from pain or fear. The man in the black suit stopped directly in front of them. He stood there silently, looking down at the scene as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. His eyes moved from the young man's bruised face to Lillian's small body kneeling next to him, and then to the empty painkiller packet on the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. Arthur. The young man, Arthur, flinched at the sound of his name. I can explain. You were told to stay at the house, I know, but You were told it was not safe. I just needed... And now you are bleeding on a public street where anyone could see you. The man's tone did not change at all, but that apology only made things worse. Do you have any concept of what I have been doing for the last 4 hours? What your mother is enduring this very moment. Arthur's head fell. I am sorry. The man's gaze shifted to Lillian, truly seeing her for the first time. His eyes narrowed, taking in her old jacket and the small hands clutching a water bottle. He saw the grocery bag, forgotten on the pavement behind her. Who are you? He demanded. Lillian's voice was weaker than she intended. Lillian Bailey? What are you doing here, Lillian Bailey? She swallowed nervously. He needed help. An emotion flashed across the man's face. It might have been surprise or perhaps confusion. So, you were helping him? Yes, sir. With what? She presented the empty water bottle. I gave him water and medicine for his pain. The man remained silent for a long moment, his stare shifting between Lillian and Arthur. When he spoke again, his voice had changed to something Lillian could not place. How much did all that cost you? It was $5. And is there more money at your house? Lillian considered lying for a second, but then she pictured her mother's expression when she returned with no food and no good reason. No, sir, she whispered. That was everything we had. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Arthur stared at her, his face filled with shock. Kid, why did you do that? Lillian answered simply, because no one else was going to. The man in the dark suit slowly crouched, lowering himself to Lillian's eye level. Up close, she saw his eyes were the same deep blue as Arthur's, the exact same shape. Do you know who I am? He asked softly. Lillian shook her head. Good. He rose to his full height again. Go home, Lillian Bailey. Lillian did not move. She knew she was supposed to leave. The man had ordered her home, and every detail about him, from his cold stare to the tattoos that marked him as dangerous, was a warning. But Arthur was still collapsed against the lamppost, barely conscious. The man standing over them had not called for an ambulance or offered any real assistance. He simply stood there, radiating a silent rage. I said, Go home, the man repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. He needs to go to a hospital, Lillian said. astonished at her own courage. The man's jaw clenched. That is not your problem. But he is hurt, Lillian. Arthur's voice was faint and pleading. Please, just leave. She looked at Arthur's battered face and saw the fear mixed with something else, maybe shame or regret. She finally realized what he was trying to communicate. He was not afraid of what the man would do to him. He was afraid of what could happen to her just for being there. Lillian got up slowly, her legs aching from kneeling on the cold concrete. She retrieved the empty grocery bag, her hands trembling now that the rush of fear was gone. Okay, she whispered. I am going. She walked 3 steps away, then paused and turned back. Mr. Bailey, she said to the man, with no idea if that was his real name. He was trying to leave, to escape. That is why he is so injured, is it not? Because he tried to run away. The man's expression remained unchanged, but a flicker of something moved in his eyes. He is your son? Lillian continued softly, as all the pieces fell into place. That is why you are so angry. Not because he is hurt, but because he left you. The quiet between them stretched on, full of danger. Then the man spoke, and his voice was even colder than before. Go home now. This time, Lillian obeyed. She walked away quickly, almost running, the empty bag swinging from her hand while her heart pounded in her chest. She never looked back, but she could feel the man's eyes following her until she disappeared around the corner. Jules Hermans watched the small girl vanish, her worn green jacket dissolving into the gray light of dawn. Then he looked down at his son. Arthur was crying now, quiet tears tracing paths down his bruised face. It was not from the pain. Jules had seen his son injured before, had watched him endure beatings that would have broken other men. This was something different. She spent her last $5 on me, Arthur said, his voice cracking. Did you hear him say that? Her final $5. Jules said nothing, a child. A 9-year-old child did what 30 other people refused to do. They all just walked right by me, Dad. Every single one. But she, he stopped, clutching his side. She did not even think about it. She was foolish, Jules stated bluntly. Reckless. She could have been harmed. She was kind. Arthur looked up at his father, his eyes red and swollen. When was the last time you saw that? True kindness, not loyalty that was bought with money or enforced by fear, just, he gestured weakly toward the empty water bottle and the painkiller wrapper, just someone helping another person because it was the right thing to do. Jules picked up the painkiller packet from the pavement. He examined the plain white box, the cheapest brand the store sold. He thought of the little girl's old jacket, her polite way of talking, and the empty grocery bag. That was everything we had. She is just a child, Jules said, though he felt a tightness in his chest. She does not understand how the world works yet. Maybe we are the ones who do not understand, Arthur replied quietly. Look at us. Look at what we have turned into. I tried to leave the family business, and my own family sends me to the hospital for it. I am lying on a street corner at sunrise, beaten nearly to death, and the only person who showed any compassion was a little girl who gave away her family's dinner money. Jules's hands tightened into fists. You understood the rules when you decided to walk away. Yes, I did. Arthur's laugh was harsh. I knew that wanting to be something other than a criminal would get me hurt. I knew trying to live a normal life would make me a target. I understood all of that. And I still believed, he paused, shutting his eyes. I still believed I could be a better man than this. You are my son. I am your property. Arthur's voice cracked. There is a distinction. Jules felt those words hit him like a punch, but his face remained a mask of stone. You believe leaving makes you a better person? You think working some low-wage job and pretending you are not a Hermans will change who you are? It changes who I could become. You are weak. No, Dad. Arthur looked straight at him, and through the bruises and the blood, his gaze was firm. I am exhausted. I am tired of all the violence. I am tired of constantly watching my back. I am tired of knowing that every person who smiles at me is either scared of me or wants something from me. He gestured to the empty street. That little girl had no idea who I was. She did not know about our family or the money or any of it. She just saw a person who was hurt and decided to help. She saw a victim. You think that is what you are now? A victim? I think I am someone who wants to be worthy of help. Arthur's voice fell to a whisper. The way she thought I was. Jules stared at his son for a long, silent moment. Then he took out his phone and made a call. It is me, he said when the call connected. Send a car to 4th and Morrison. Have the medical team ready at the house. He paused. And I want you to find out everything there is to know about a girl named Lillian Bailey, 9 years old, who lives around here. Everything. Where she lives, who her people are, what they are lacking. Arthur's eyes went wide. Dad, if she spent her last $5 on you, Jules said, ending the call, then someone has to make sure she has $5 tomorrow. He looked down at his son, his expression a mix of anger and something much more complex. Think of it as a payment for services. You cannot just, I can do anything I want. Jules's voice became hard again. That is the meaning of power, Arthur. I cannot force the world to be kind, but I can make sure that kind people do not go hungry because of it. Within 3 minutes, a black sedan arrived at the curb. 2 men in dark suits got out, moving with the smooth efficiency of men who had done this many times. With gentle hands, they guided Arthur into the car, careful of his shattered ribs. Jules remained on the curb, watching the vehicle pull away. The creased wrapper for the painkillers was still clutched in his fist. He had constructed an entire kingdom on intimidation and violence, teaching everyone that defying Jules Herman's brought ruin. For 25 years, he taught this city his name was a synonym for fear. Then a small girl, with only $5 to her name, had shown him a truth he had long since forgotten. Terror was not the only form of strength in the world. Lillian managed to walk 3 blocks before her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the steps of her apartment building, the vacant grocery sack, a crumpled mess at her side, wondering how she could possibly explain to her mother why she was returning with nothing. Explaining what happened felt like an impossible task. I gave the money for our meals to a bleeding man, and then his father, who looked like he could snap a person in two, told me to run. Her mother would be consumed by fear or rage, or maybe both. Lillian pushed her hands down on her knees, trying to force them to be still. The sun was climbing higher, casting a pale light over the street. In an hour, her mother would be awake, expecting the bread and milk Lillian was supposed to bring. She pictured Arthur swallowing the pills, the way his hand trembled as he took the water. She remembered the sheer panic in his expression when he saw his father coming. He tried to get away. That is what she had said. And the powerful man, his father, never denied it. Arthur was running from something, and his own people had punished him for it. What kind of a life was that? Lillian had never understood her mother's warnings about certain men. The men in her neighborhood, with costly watches and cars worth more than their entire building. The ones people only spoke about in hushed tones, never to their faces. Suddenly she understood. She grabbed the empty bag and got to her feet, her legs unsteady. There was no sense in waiting. She had made her decision on that street corner. Now she would have to live with it. Silence greeted her as she crept into their small apartment. Her mother was still on the sofa, asleep in her work uniform, an arm thrown across her face to shield her from the light. Lillian placed the empty bag on the kitchen counter and sat at the table to wait. 15 miles away, Jules Herman stood in his private study. He was looking at a picture he kept hidden in a desk drawer, one he almost never viewed. It showed his wife, Caroline, holding their son, Arthur, 20 years earlier. That was before the illness, before he had to tell a 5-year-old boy that his mother was gone forever. Caroline was the one person who could reach his softer side. She alone could see beyond the violent reputation to the man he was before ambition erased him. "You have to teach him to be strong," she had told him in her final days, her voice a fragile whisper. "But you must promise me, Jules, do not teach him to be cruel. There is a great difference." He made the promise. Then she was gone, and Jules was left to raise a boy in a world that devoured kindness. So he showed Arthur how to be strong, how to maintain control, and how to command respect, born from fear. He taught his son how to make impossible choices without showing emotion. He taught him everything he knew, except how to find happiness. Arthur had made an effort. He was brilliant in the family business, a sharp and strategic mind capable of the necessary, calculated violence. But over the years, Jules saw a light fade from his son's eyes, a slow extinguishing of his spirit. 6 months ago, Arthur had requested to leave. Jules told him no. "You do not leave the Herman family. You are born in it, and you die in it." The empire Jules just created owned every moment in between. That was the exchange for the life they had, for the wealth, the influence, and the security. But Arthur tried to leave all the same, and Jules's most trusted lieutenants, men loyal for decades, made an example of him. They showed everyone what happened when you tried to leave. Not even the boss's son was exempt, especially not the boss's son. Jules learned of it 3 hours after it happened. He had spent the early morning tearing through the city, calling in every favor and making every threat, a cold dread gripping him that he had not felt since Caroline's illness. And he finally located his son on a sidewalk corner, kept from death by a 9-year-old girl who gave him her family's last $5. Jules returned the photograph to the drawer and lifted his phone. "Report," he said when the call connected. His second-in-command answered, "Lillian Bailey, age 9. The voice was crisp. "Address is 447 Morrison Street, apartment 3C. Mother's name is Rebecca Bailey. She works the night shift cleaning downtown offices. Father is not in the record. They are 2 months delinquent on rent. The mother has been taking extra shifts, but the property manager is starting eviction proceedings." Jules shut his eyes. "Continue. The girl has perfect attendance at school, but she receives free lunch. No behavioral problems. Her teachers call her quiet. She keeps to herself. She is intelligent, reads at a level 2 grades higher than her own." There was a brief silence. "Boss, they are barely making it. This month's rent payment would take every dollar the mother has saved." "What more?" "The building is a wreck. Code violations for years. The heating is unreliable, faulty wiring. The entire structure should be condemned, but the rent is low, so people live there." Jules thought of what Arthur said. A little girl who gave away the money for her family's dinner. He had dedicated 25 years to building his power, gathering his fortune, and making sure the entire city understood that crossing Jules Herman had severe consequences. He had purchased allegiance and paid for safety. He made sure his family would never need anything, yet his own son had tried to flee from it all. At the same time, a little girl who had nothing ran into danger to aid a stranger. "Sir?" the man on the phone asked. "What are your orders?" Jules was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the drawer that held the picture of his wife. "Do not teach him to be cruel. There is a great difference. Send a man to 447 Morrison Street," he said at last, his voice low. "I want their past due rent settled. Inform the manager it has been handled by an anonymous party. Pay their utilities for the rest of the year, and arrange for a delivery of groceries, enough to last them at least a month. It must be completely anonymous. They cannot know who it came from. Jules stopped for a moment. Create a college trust fund for the girl. Put enough in it so that money will never be a concern for her when she is old enough to access it. There was silence from the other end. Then, boss, if I may ask, why are you doing this? Jules thought of Arthur's broken body, of the tears in his son's eyes when he spoke of the girl's compassion, and of 20 years spent making his son hard. Maybe he should have taught him how to be human, because kind people should not be left to starve for their kindness, he said softly. Sir, I do not understand. Just get it done. Jules' voice turned hard again, the sound that signaled the end of a discussion. And I want reports on the girl. If she requires anything, school supplies, a winter coat, anything at all, it is to be provided. He hung up the phone before his subordinate could object. Then Jules did something he had not done in 15 years. He walked to a corner of the study where a bottle of his wife's preferred whiskey had remained sealed since her funeral. He poured a small amount into a glass and lifted it toward the drawer. He could not see the photograph, but he knew it was there. I am trying, Caroline, he whispered to the silent room. I do not know if this is enough, but I am trying. The alcohol burned as he drank. Outside, the sun was bright, and across the city, a young girl was likely struggling to tell her mother an unbelievable story about an empty bag. Jules hoped she would tell the truth. He hoped her mother would believe her, and he hoped, in a place he would never speak of, that in all the fear and violence he had created, enough of his own humanity remained to know goodness when he saw it, even from the smallest and most unexpected person. Lillian's mother awoke 40 minutes later. She pushed herself up, confused, a hand pressed to her aching back. Her work uniform was creased, her hair a mess. Her hair still pulled back from a shift that ended 12 hours before. Her eyes landed on Lillian at the kitchen table, and she smiled. Then she saw the empty grocery bag on the counter. The smile vanished. Sweetheart, where is the bread? Lillian had rehearsed the words, but they still felt wrong. I gave the money to someone. Her mother was instantly on her feet, alert. What? A man was outside the store. He was bleeding, and people were just walking by him, and Lillian's voice trembled. I bought him water and bandages instead. I am so sorry. All the color washed out of her mother's face. You walked up to a strange man, an injured one. Lillian, what were you thinking? He was dying, Mama. I couldn't just leave him. Yes, you could have. Her mother's voice was sharp with terror. You absolutely could have kept walking. That is exactly what you should have done. She closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, her hands gripping Lillian's shoulders. Did he touch you? Did he hurt you? Did anyone see you? No, Mama. It was not like that. You do not understand what happened. Her mother's hands trembled. You are 9 years old, Lillian. 9. You do not talk to strangers. You do not get involved. And you certainly do not spend our last dollars on them. She stopped, shutting her eyes. Oh no. That was our last $5. I am sorry. An apology does not buy us breakfast. Her mother released Lillian and fell into a chair, burying her face in her hands. An apology does not explain to your teachers why you are too hungry to stay awake in class. An apology does not. Her voice broke. Honey, I worked so hard to keep you safe, and you threw that safety away for a stranger. Lillian felt tears sting her eyes. He needed my help. And what about what we need? Her mother looked up, and Lillian saw a look she had never seen before. It was not just fear, it was pure desperation. I cannot protect you if you refuse to protect yourself. This place, these people, they are not kind, Lillian. They are dangerous. And you just made yourself a target. What are you talking about? Her mother rushed to the window, pulling back the thin curtain to look outside. If that man was so hurt he could not get up, he was involved in something bad. Gangs, drugs, something. And now someone saw you help him. Someone knows who you are. His father came, Lillian said softly. He told me I should go home. Her mother spun back from the window. His father? He wore an expensive suit. He had tattoos on his hands. He seemed, Lillian tried to find the right description, powerful, dangerously powerful. A heavy silence filled the small apartment. Her mother returned to the table, her face pale. Describe him to me. Lillian described everything: the dark suit, the ink on his skin, the way the crowd parted for him without a word. She described the cold eyes that had looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. Her mother sank into the chair. Oh no. Oh, Lillian. What is it? Who was he? I do not know his name, but men like that. She covered her mouth with her hands. We have to leave. As soon as I have the money, we are getting out of this neighborhood. Mama, you are frightening me. Good. Her mother's voice was like ice. You need to be frightened. I am frightened. Those men, Lillian, the ones in suits with tattoos and all that money, you do not help them. You run from them. But he was hurt. I do not care. Her mother slammed a hand on the table, and Lillian flinched. I do not care if he was dying on the sidewalk. You keep walking. You always, always keep walking. They sat in the quiet, Lillian crying softly, while her mother stared at the empty grocery bag, as if it were a piece of evidence. At last, her mother spoke again, her voice much lower. I need you to make me a promise. What is it? If you ever see that man again, the father, you run. You do not speak to him. You do not even look at him. You run straight back here, and you lock the door. Do you understand me? Lillian nodded, but she did not understand at all. And if anyone asks what happened this morning, you say you cannot remember. You were sleepy, you were confused. You have no idea what they're talking about. Can you do that for me? Yes, Mama. Her mother pulled her into a fierce hug, holding her as if she might simply vanish. I love you so much. You know that, do you not? Every single thing I do, every shift I work, it is all for you. I know. Then please, sweetheart, please just stay small, stay safe. The world is a cruel place. Do not try to fix it. But Lillian had learned a different lesson from her mother. The same woman who once gave their last $5 to a homeless man in the freezing rain. The woman who taught her that poverty was not an excuse to be unkind. She did not say any of this. She just hugged her mother back. The stories began that afternoon. Mrs. Patel from down the hall told Mrs. Patterson she saw a little girl on the street that morning. Mrs. Patterson then told the building manager. He told the owner of the corner market, who then told the retired police officer who came in for coffee each day. By that evening, the whole neighborhood knew. Lillian Bailey had been seen with someone tied to those people, the criminal organizations that operated in the city's shadows. The next morning, everything was different. Neighbors who used to greet Lillian now crossed the street when they saw her coming. Mothers held their children a little tighter as she walked by. Her teacher, who always had a warm smile for her, barely met her gaze. At lunchtime, the table around her was empty. At recess, the schoolyard was a lonely place. On her way home, a rock flew past her head. From a nearby alley, she heard someone hiss the word traitor. She could not see who said it. When she got home, her mother was already there. She had been sent home from her job. Someone called the cleaning service and hinted that they should reconsider employing Rebecca Bailey. They never said exactly why. They did not need to. Her mother was on the couch, holding the eviction notice they had received 2 weeks ago, and she was crying without a sound. Mama, we will be all right, her mother said, but her voice betrayed her. We will find a way. We always do. That night, Lillian was awake for hours. She listened as her mother called family who did not pick up the phone. She heard her call shelters that had no room. She heard her call churches that only offered prayers. For the first time, Lillian wondered if her mother was right. Maybe kindness was a price they could not pay. Maybe trying to be good only made you suffer more in a world so cruel. She thought of Arthur's bruised face and his father's cold stare. She thought of the $5 that might cost them their home. Outside, a car with blacked-out windows drove slowly past their building. A second one followed, and then a third. Lillian hid under her thin blanket, trying not to imagine what would happen next. 3 days later, the black cars arrived. Lillian was walking home from school, alone as always, when she saw them. There were 4 black sedans. They were the expensive kind, with dark windows and shiny chrome that reflected the gray sky. They moved down Morrison Street like a slow, deliberate funeral march. Her stomach tightened. She had seen cars like that in her neighborhood before, but never so many at once, never moving with such quiet purpose. They did not speed, they did not rush, they just moved forward, and the rest of the world simply moved out of their path. Lillian's first thought was to run. Her mother's warning screamed in her mind. If you see that man, you run. But her feet were stuck to the pavement. The cars turned onto her street. People on the sidewalk stopped dead in their tracks. A mother pulled her son into a shop. Mr. Park, who was setting up his fruit stand, froze with a crate of oranges in his arms. The procession of cars stopped right in front of Lillian's apartment building. "Oh no," she heard someone whisper. "Oh dear God, no." The car doors opened together, perfectly timed. Men in dark suits got out. First 6, then 8, then 10 of them. They moved with a military discipline that spoke of endless practice. They spread out, forming a perimeter around the entrance to the building. Then, the door of the front car opened. Jules Herman emerged. He wore the same black suit from that morning, with no tie. The tattoos on his hands and neck were visible. But something about him was different. Before, he had seemed angry and restrained. Now he just looked calm and determined. Lillian's heart pounded in her chest. The entire street had fallen silent. It was as if the whole city was holding its breath. Jules scanned the area, his gaze sweeping over the crowd that had gathered at a safe distance. His eyes finally locked onto Lillian, frozen on the sidewalk 30 feet from him, her school bag slipping off her shoulder. They stared at each other. Lillian braced herself for his anger. She expected him to shout at her, to blame her for some crime she did not understand. But he did something else entirely. He gave her a single, small nod. It was a brief sign of acknowledgement, but it felt like he was giving her permission for something. Then he turned and walked into her building. Inside apartment 3C, Rebecca Bailey was packing their belongings. For 3 days, she had been trying to find a solution, a place to go, a way to survive. She had sold the few things of value they owned, her winter coat, their small television set, even the necklace from her own mother. It was not nearly enough. It never was. She was folding Lillian's shirts into a plastic garbage bag. They did not even own a suitcase. It was then she heard them. Heavy footsteps in the hall, more than one person, walking with intent. Her heart turned to ice. A knock came at the door, 3 hard sounds that were not a request. They were a command. Rebecca stood, motionless, a child's shirt clutched in her trembling fingers. Another knock, louder this time. "Miss Bailey?" a man's voice called out. "We have to talk with you. It concerns your daughter, Lillian." Rebecca let the shirt fall. She ran to the door and pulled it open without a thought, without looking. If her daughter was in trouble, nothing else mattered. 2 men in dark suits filled her doorway. Beyond them, she saw more. They saw at least 6 of them, a solid wall of grim faces and expensive clothing. "Where is Lillian?" Rebecca cried, her voice breaking. "What have you done? If you hurt her, I swear to you." "Your daughter is all right," one of the men said with a calm voice. "She is just downstairs. Mr. Herman wishes to speak with you both. This is not a request." But the man's tone was not aggressive. It was almost polite, even gentle. Rebecca's mind raced with possibilities. She could try to slam the door, lock it, and call the police. But what would be the point? The police rarely came to this part of town unless it was absolutely necessary, and men like these did not knock politely and ask for permission. "Let me get my shoes," she finally said, her voice unsteady. The man nodded and stepped aside. Rebecca put on her worn sneakers and followed them downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. When she stepped out onto the street, she saw why it had become so quiet. The whole block was filled with people, her neighbors, local shop owners, and strangers, all drawn by the unusual scene. They kept their distance, watching with a blend of fear and fascination. The black cars were parked around her building like a fortress, and standing in the middle of it all was Jules Herman. Rebecca's gaze found Lillian instantly. Her daughter was standing near the building's entrance, looking small and frightened, but she was safe. Rebecca ran to her and hugged her tightly. "Did they do anything to you?" "No, Mama. They just told me to wait here." Jules walked toward them slowly, keeping his hands in plain sight. It was a non-threatening gesture, but his very presence was a threat. "Miss Bailey," he said softly, "I am sorry for this dramatic display, but I had to be certain we would not be disturbed. What do you want?" Rebecca pulled Lillian even closer. "To offer my thanks to your daughter." Jules's voice was loud enough for everyone on the silent street to hear. "3 days ago, she saved my son's life." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Rebecca just stared at him. "What?" "Arthur Herman, the young man your daughter found injured on the street." Jules gazed down at Lillian on the street. This child had used her last $5 on his son for water and medicine while the whole world ignored him. She had remained by his side despite her fear. She had offered compassion to someone who had earned none. A crowd was gathering, spilling from doorways, curious about the commotion. Rebecca's voice trembled. "I do not understand. Why have you come here?" Jules moved his hand to his jacket with deliberate slowness, showing everyone he was only reaching into his pocket. He produced an envelope. "Because this entire neighborhood needs to hear the truth," he announced, his voice carrying to every listener. "For 3 days, you have treated this mother and daughter like outcasts. You have shunned them, condemned them, and made them prisoners in their own house." His tone sharpened. "You decided that an act of kindness was a crime." He offered the envelope to Rebecca. "Your little girl did something most grown-ups would not. She found a person in pain, and she offered her help. Without question, without judgment, without fear." Jules scanned the faces of the silent onlookers. "She is 9 years old, yet she is braver than any person here." Rebecca accepted the envelope, her hands trembling too much to open it. Jules addressed the entire crowd. "Lillian Bailey is the reason my son is not dead. If any of you show her or her mother disrespect from now on, you will deal with me directly. Am I understood?" The quiet that followed was absolute. Then Jules did the unthinkable. The city's most feared man, a king of violence and shadows, lowered himself to his knees before Lillian. He knelt on the grimy pavement in his fine suit and met the eyes of a little girl. "Thank you," he murmured, "for saving my son's life, for showing courage when you had no reason to, for choosing kindness when the world makes it a weakness." Lillian's voice was a whisper. "Is Arthur all right?" An expression shifted on Jules's face. Perhaps it was surprise, or something else entirely. He is getting better because of you. I am happy to hear that. Jules rose to his feet. He turned back to Rebecca. Rid what is inside after we are gone. And if there is anything you require, my associates can find me. He started to walk away as his men closed in around him. Wait! Lillian cried. Jules paused. Please tell Arthur I hope he can escape, she said. For good this time. Tell him he should be happy. For a long second, Jules remained motionless, his back turned. He gave a single, sharp nod and continued to his vehicle. The dark cars departed as silently as they had come. They left a street of shocked people and one small girl, now under the protection of the city's most notorious figure. Rebecca stared at the envelope, her fear making it heavy in her hands. When she finally broke the seal, her legs gave out and she sank to the sidewalk. It contained a bank check that would pay for 6 months of their housing. And a note in neat script, kindness is not a crime to be punished. J.H. Rebecca Bailey sat on the curb, the check shaking in her grip. Lillian stood near, confused by the unfolding events. 6 months of rent. It was an impossible sum. It was more than her mother earned in 3 months of cleaning buildings all night. It was more money than they had ever seen. Mama? Lillian put a hand on her mother's arm. What is it? Rebecca was unable to form words. She simply presented the check. Lillian stared at the amount, counted the zeros again, and felt a wave of dizziness. Is that real? Before her mother could respond, one of the departing sedans braked and backed up. A back door swung open, and a young man emerged, one hand held to his side. Arthur. He appeared stronger than he had 3 days prior. The puffiness in his features had subsided. His worst bruises were now a sickly yellow, but each movement was clearly painful. As he approached, Lillian saw how carefully he carried his body. The crowd, which had begun to scatter, went still once more. Arthur halted a few feet away, keeping his hands in sight to show he meant no harm. Miss Bailey, he said to Rebecca, could I talk with you and your daughter for a moment? Rebecca got to her feet, placing herself between him and Lillian. Have your family not caused enough trouble? No, Arthur replied softly. We have not done nearly what is required. He reached inside his coat, echoing his father's deliberate motion, and produced a second envelope. This one much thicker. The check from my father will handle your housing, Arthur explained. This is for all other expenses. Rebecca refused to accept it. I will not take your money. I understand. Arthur's tone was kind. But your daughter offered me her last $5 when she had nothing. She did it when she should not have, when every other person on this street advised against it. He glanced at Lillian. She kept me alive, and I have to ensure that decision does not destroy her future. We do not accept charity, Rebecca stated. This is not charity. Arthur offered the envelope with more insistence. It is a payment for the medicine and water that sustained me until my people arrived. For a bravery I did not earn, but was given freely. Rebecca did not move, but Lillian saw her mother's determination begin to crack. Inside, Arthur went on, is enough to settle all of your overdue bills. Your power, your heating, your water, all the things you have sacrificed to buy food. His voice faltered for a moment. I understand impossible choices now. I know your daughter's choice cost you dearly. She did it because of what I taught her, Rebecca said, her voice strained. I taught her to help anyone who is in pain, even if you do not have the money, even if it brings you trouble. I know. Arthur regarded her with profound respect. My own mother taught me that before she passed away, before I lost my way. He paused. Your daughter helped me remember its meaning. He placed the envelope on the stoop and then presented a folded document. This is for a trust fund, he explained. It is in Lillian's name. She cannot touch the money until she is 18, but on that day, it will be enough for university, or for any path she chooses. He met Rebecca's eyes. A kind act at 9 years old should not lead to poverty at 19. Rebecca's expression broke. Why would you do all this? Arthur was silent, his hand still on his injured side. When he finally answered, his voice was thick with feeling. Because 30 people passed me by that morning, he said. 30 people saw me bleeding in the gutter and chose to do nothing. They saw a person in need, and they made the sensible decision. They kept themselves safe. They held on to their money and their peace of mind. He looked right at Lillian. But you were different. You saw pain, and you ran to it. You gave everything you possessed to a stranger that everyone called a problem. His voice cracked. Do you have any idea how uncommon that is? Can you see what you have done? Lillian shook her head as tears began to fall. You showed that compassion is not dead, Arthur said. Not in a world that tries to crush it, or a community that rejects it. In a life where it is almost impossible, you still made that choice. You chose goodness when it cost you everything. He lowered himself with a pained expression, his injured ribs complaining, until he was at her eye level, just as his father had been. I am sorry, he said, his own tears now flowing freely. I am so sorry that my trouble made your life difficult. I am sorry they treated you as if you were the one at fault. I am sorry you discovered that the world punishes good deeds. It is all right, Lillian whispered. No, it is not. Arthur shook his head. None of it is all right. But I will try. For the rest of my days, I will try to prove that your action mattered. He rose carefully and turned to the crowd, which had crept closer, drawn by the drama. All of you should listen, Arthur declared, his voice gaining strength. This child taught me a lesson I had forgotten. Real power is not fear or wealth or domination. It is the choice to help when you are not compelled, when you gain nothing, when you lose something. He scanned the faces of the neighbors who had ostracized Lillian, the store owners who had ignored her, the parents who had steered their own children away. You all walked past me, Arthur said plainly. Every single one of you. And I will not forget. I would not have blamed you. A part of me expected it. But your daughter did not walk away. She chose to stop. That single choice is worth more than all the money my family possesses. The only sound on the street was someone sobbing softly at the edge of the crowd. Arthur faced Rebecca again. I cannot change what happened to you. I cannot force people to see you differently. But my father can make them hesitate before they hurt you again. What I can do is ensure your daughter's compassion does not make you homeless. Her bravery will not leave you hungry. Her kindness will not be the end of your life. With trembling hands, Rebecca reached down and took the envelopes. Inside the second one, she found payment confirmations for the utilities she was sure they would lose. She pressed a hand to her mouth. There is one other thing, Arthur said, his voice low. He held out a business card to her. My father is creating a foundation right here in this neighborhood. It will provide food, after-school programs, and safe passage for children. It will support families struggling to get by. He looked over at Lillian. We are naming it the Caroline Herman Foundation for my mother, but if I am being honest, it should be the Lillian Bailey Foundation. She is the one who reminded us what is truly important. Rebecca just looked at the card. Why would you tell me this? Arthur met her gaze. Because it needs a director. It needs someone who knows the choice between paying rent and buying food. It needs someone who understands this place. It needs someone who raised a little girl, brave enough to give a stranger her last $5. Rebecca's eyes grew wide. Are you offering me a job? I am offering you a way to help countless other families, with a proper salary and benefits, so you never have to decide between Lillian's safety and her next meal. Arthur's tone softened. In a world full of cruelty, you taught your child to be kind. We need that. This community needs that. Rebecca looked from Lillian to the envelopes clutched in her hand, and then to Arthur's bruised but sincere face. I do not know what to say. Just say you will consider it, Arthur suggested. Say you will allow your daughter's kindness to save more than just one life. Say you will help us build a community where helping others is not a mistake. Rebecca gave a slow nod, unable to form words. For the first time, Lillian saw a genuine smile spread across Arthur's face. Thank you, he said, to both of you, for everything. He moved stiffly back to the waiting vehicle, and the black car drove away. The crowd stood frozen in a stunned quiet. Then, one person at a time, the neighbors started to come forward. Mrs. Patel, from their building, came first, tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. Mr. Park, from the market, followed, holding a bag filled with food. The teacher who had ignored Lillian at school approached with shame on her face. I am so sorry, Mrs. Patel whispered, taking Rebecca's hand. I am so sorry for how we treated you. We were wrong, Mr. Park said, placing the bag of groceries into Lillian's small arms. Completely wrong. The teacher knelt so she was eye level with Lillian. You are the most courageous person I have ever met. I should have said that to you 3 days ago. One after another, the community that had cast them out came to apologize, to recognize what Lillian had done, and to confess their own shame. And Rebecca Bailey, holding 3 envelopes that promised her daughter would be fed, finally allowed herself to weep. The Caroline Herman Foundation launched 6 weeks after that moment on Morrison Street. It was located in a renovated warehouse that once served as a storage facility for Jules Herman's illegal operations. Everyone appreciated the irony. Arthur stood in the middle of the large room, watching workers finish installing the kitchen, and tried to recall the last time he felt this sense of meaning. It was not the empty pride of finishing a task for his father's empire. It was not the high of power and violence. It was a real purpose, the kind that made getting out of bed feel right. The food shipment is due at 7, Rebecca Bailey announced, checking the clipboard she now took with her everywhere. She had accepted the director role 3 weeks prior, after 2 weeks of relentless questioning to ensure it was not some kind of trick. It was real. Jules Herman had funded the foundation with $2 million for its first year, pledging more if they could show tangible results. He had sent a clear message through his network. The foundation was off limits. Anyone who interfered with it, stole from it, or harmed its people would have to deal with him. It was fear used to protect kindness. It was the most unusual thing Arthur had ever seen his father do. Volunteer orientation begins at 8, Rebecca said. We have 12 signed up, all from the neighborhood, all people who understand the struggles here. Mrs. Patel is leading a cooking class on Thursdays. Mr. Park is giving us fresh produce 2 times a week. Arthur smiled faintly. These are the same people who avoided looking at you last month. People can change when you give them a reason, Rebecca stated plainly. And when they witness someone with great power choose mercy over punishment. She was not wrong. Jules Herman's public support for Lillian had sent a tremor through the area. People who had spent their lives in fear now saw that the most powerful man around had used his influence to shield a 9-year-old girl for an act of kindness. It changed the entire equation of survival in ways Arthur was still processing. Will she be here today? Arthur asked. Rebecca nodded. After school. She wants to see the place before our grand opening tomorrow. Arthur felt a flicker of nerves, for reasons he could not explain. Lillian had been to the site 2 times. During the building phase, quietly advising on layouts, on colors that would feel safe on whether chairs were the right size for little kids. She had been reserved both times, speaking only when asked. Arthur recognized the weight she shouldered, the burden of being the girl whose name was on everyone's lips, the child who changed the world with one simple act. The door swung open at 3:45. Lillian entered with her mother, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She froze just past the doorway, her eyes widening in disbelief. The warehouse was reborn. Walls that were once dark and grimy now glowed with bright paint. Harsh industrial bulbs had given way to warm, gentle light. Colorful rugs now covered the cold concrete floor. One corner was a complete professional kitchen. Another had tables and chairs for family meals. A third was a home workstation with desks and shelves full of books. The last corner was a dedicated play zone with soft mats, toys for every age, and beanbag chairs for reading. "What do you think?" Arthur asked softly. Lillian moved through the room in a daze, touching surfaces as if she feared they were an illusion. She traced the spines of books on a shelf, tested the give of a beanbag chair, and then simply stood before the kitchen, staring. "It is beautiful," she whispered at last. "Your mother was the main designer," Arthur told her. "But we used all your suggestions. The reading nook was your idea." Lillian gazed at the cozy space, with its soft pillows, gentle lighting, and books sorted by grade level. "Really?" "Really." Arthur came to stand beside her. "You told us kids needed a place to get lost in a story, a place to forget hunger and fear for a while." Lillian gave a slow nod. "Sometimes that is the only thing that works." Arthur felt a painful crack in his own chest. This 9-year-old girl knew more about survival than he had learned in a lifetime. She had endured poverty, fear, and impossible decisions, yet she had somehow kept her heart open to kindness. "I have something else for you," Arthur said. "Over here." He guided her back to the entrance, where a new bronze plaque had been installed that morning. Lillian read the words aloud, her voice growing softer with each line. "The Caroline Hermans Foundation, created in memory of Caroline Hermans, who taught us that kindness is a choice, not a weakness, and in honor of Lillian Bailey, who proved she was right." Lillian looked up at Arthur, her eyes filled with tears. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, we did." Arthur knelt to meet her gaze. "Do you know why?" She shook her head. "Because in 50 years, long after we are gone, this place will still stand. People will see this plaque and ask who Lillian Bailey was, and someone will tell them the story. She was a little girl who used her last $5 to save a stranger. She was only 9, and she changed everything." "I did not change everything," Lillian said softly. "I only helped one person." "You helped one person," Arthur confirmed. "And that person happened to be the son of Jules Hermans. That one act started a chain of events that created this." He gestured to the room around them. 200 children will get a meal here every day. 50 families will get help with their bills each week. 100 kids will have a safe place to be after school instead of a dangerous street or an empty home. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You saved a single person, and now that person is trying to save hundreds more. That is how kindness works. It grows. It spreads. One small gesture can become bigger than you ever dreamed." His voice broke. "You taught me that. You taught my father that, and we will spend our lives making sure others learn it too." Lillian wiped at her tears. "Is your father coming to the opening tomorrow?" Arthur paused. "He will be here, but not in public. He wants the focus to be on the community, not him. He will watch from afar." "That is sad," Lillian observed. "He should see what he created." "He knows what he created," Arthur replied. "And for him, that is enough." It was not the entire truth. Jules Hermans battled every day with the paradox of building something good from money made through violence. But he visited the site most nights after everyone had left, walking the quiet halls, touching the new walls, and looking at the books. Arthur had found him there 3 nights before, standing by the plaque with his hand pressed against the letters of his wife's name. She would have liked this, Jules had said, his voice low. She would have loved it, Arthur corrected him. I am not a good man, Arthur. This does not fix that. No, Arthur had agreed. But it is a beginning. It is the choice to be better. Maybe that is what counts. Jules had gone without saying more. But Arthur saw a change in his father's shoulders, a little less tense, a little less guarded, as if, perhaps, he was learning to carry something besides fear. Now, as he watched Lillian trace her own name on the bronze plate, Arthur felt that same change in himself. He had spent 20 years learning to hurt people, to control them with fear. Learning to help was 1,000 times harder, but it was the only thing that had made him feel human again. Thank you, Lillian said suddenly, her eyes meeting his. For this? For everything. For not being angry that I helped you. Arthur let out a surprised laugh. Angry? Lillian, you are the only reason I am alive. I owe you my thanks every single day for the rest of my life. You already did, she replied simply. You built this. Rebecca came over and put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. We should let Arthur get ready for tomorrow. But before they turned to go, Arthur stopped them. Wait, one more thing. He went to the kitchen and came back holding a small frame. Inside, a $5 bill was beautifully preserved over a small metal plate that read, "The first donation to the Caroline Hermans Foundation from Lillian Bailey, age 9. Value, everything." Lillian stared at it, speechless. Is that my actual $5? Arthur smiled. No, your mother needed that for food. But this stands for what you gave. It will hang in our office forever to remind us why we are here. He hung it on the wall next to the main plaque. The evening sun caught the bill, making it glow like a treasure. To Arthur it was. The foundation's opening day started with perfect spring weather, the kind that made even Morrison Street seem almost lovely. A line of families stretched down the street and around the corner. Parents clutched their children's hands. Old residents leaned on walkers. Teenagers, drawn by the promise of a free meal, waited with skeptical but hungry eyes. Inside, volunteers hurried with last-minute tasks. Mrs. Patel ran the kitchen, where giant pans of eggs sizzled and stacks of fresh bread waited. Mr. Park organized donated fruits and vegetables by the door, available to anyone in need. Teachers set up the homework stations. Local teens from Arthur's job program, wearing matching shirts, helped direct people. Rebecca stood in the middle of the controlled chaos, clipboard forgotten, watching her neighborhood become something she had only dreamed of, a community. Ready? Arthur asked, coming up beside her. I am terrified, Rebecca confessed. What if nobody shows up? What if it is not enough? What if, Rebecca? Arthur smiled gently. There are 200 people waiting for us. Tomorrow, there will be more. We cannot help everyone, but we can help someone, and that someone might help someone else. That is the whole point. She took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, let us open the doors. Arthur unlocked the entrance. The first family stepped inside, a young mother with 3 children under the age of 6. They all shared the same haunted expression of people who go to bed hungry. The smallest child, no older than 4, saw the food and began to cry. It is all right, baby, the mother soothed, her own voice cracking. It is all right. We get to eat today. Mrs. Patel was there in an instant, pressing full plates into the mother's hands. Sit down, eat. There is more than enough. And there was. For 3 hours, the foundation gave breakfast to all who entered. There were no forms, no questions, no hoops to jump through. There was only food and warmth and the quiet understanding that every person deserved a meal. Lillian came at 9 o'clock, after Rebecca had called the school to say she would be late. She stood near the entrance, watching families share tables. She saw children laughing and volunteers refilling drinks. Arthur noticed her and came over. "What do you think? I think my $5 became something very big," Lillian said softly. "It did," Arthur agreed. "It really did." A man approached them then, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a frayed jacket and wringing his hands. "Excuse me, are you Arthur Herman?" Arthur's body tensed from old habit. "I am. I just—" "I wanted to say," the man's voice trembled, "my kids have not eaten a proper breakfast in 3 weeks. Today they ate until their bellies were full. So thank you. Just thank you." He turned and left before Arthur could find words, leaving him standing there with tears in his eyes. "That is going to happen a lot," Lillian said with wisdom. "They are thanking you." "I am not accustomed to being thanked," Arthur confessed. "In my family's line of work, people tend to run away when they see me." "Perhaps this can be your new business," Lillian offered. "The thank you business, not the fear business." Arthur actually laughed. The sound was unfamiliar, but good. The thank you business. I like the sound of that. A black car pulled up to the curb, outside, but did not park. Arthur could see the outline of his father through the tinted glass, watching the flow of people moving in and out of the foundation. Jules never came in during operating hours, but Arthur knew he visited at night. He would walk through the silent building, run a hand along the newly painted walls, and read the mission statement posted near the entrance. Last week, Arthur had discovered a handwritten note on his office desk. It was just 2 lines in his father's neat script. "Your mother would have been proud of this. I am learning to be." Arthur had folded the note carefully and placed it in his wallet, where it stayed with him every day. The morning was a storm of organized activity, feeding people, helping them, and connecting them with needed services. The homework station filled up with kids. The job board on the wall started to gather new listings. The community notice board was covered in flyers for apartment rentals, donated furniture, and volunteer requests. Around noon, when the breakfast crowd had finally thinned, Arthur saw Lillian in the reading corner. She was reading a picture book aloud to 3 smaller children, who were gathered around her as if she were a magician. He sat quietly at a distance, just listening to her voice. Lillian read with feeling and patience, pausing to show them the illustrations and ask questions. She seemed so perfectly at ease, as if she had been a teacher for years instead of just being 9 years old herself. After the book was done, the children scattered to play. Lillian looked over and saw Arthur watching her. "You are very good with them," he said. "I just like to read," Lillian answered simply. "And I know what it is like to be scared and hungry, and to just want to hide inside a story." "Do you still feel like that?" Arthur asked softly. Lillian considered his question. "Sometimes, but not as much. Now, I mostly feel—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Hopeful. Like maybe everything can get better." "It can," Arthur said. "Things are better because of you. Not only me," Lillian corrected him. "It was because many people made good choices. You, your father, my mom, Mrs. Patel, and Mr. Park. It was everyone who chose to help instead of to hurt." He knew she was right. Change was never just one person or one event. It was the sum of many choices, many small acts of bravery that grew into something much larger. "Can I tell you something?" Arthur asked. Lillian nodded. "On the street that morning, when you offered me water and medicine, I was ready to let go. I was going to die on that sidewalk because I was exhausted from trying to be a good person in a world that kept crushing me for it." His voice broke. "Then you appeared. a small girl who had almost nothing, but you offered me everything you had. He took a moment to compose himself. You saved me in so many ways, Lillian. You gave me a reason to believe my life was worth saving. You showed me why doing good is important, even when it is difficult, especially then. Lillian reached into her pocket, producing a neatly folded $5 bill. Can I tell you a secret? Arthur gave a slight nod. I carry this everywhere now. Not because I need the money. We can afford our bills and our food. I keep it because it is a reminder. She displayed the bill. It shows that $5 can transform the world if used correctly. It proves that little actions count, that your true character is revealed by what you do when no one is watching. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. Where did you get that? It was your father, Lillian answered. He gave it to me right after the foundation opened. He told me every hero needs a $5 bill, just in case they have to save someone. Arthur turned his face away, blinking rapidly. That was something his father would do. Jules Hermans, a man whose empire was built on terror and brutality, gave a little girl $5 to teach her that kindness held more value than power. Perhaps people could truly change. What will you do with it now? Arthur asked, his voice steady again. Lillian carefully folded the bill and tucked it away. I will hold on to it until I meet someone who needs it more than I do. Then I will follow what my mother taught me. I will help them, no matter the cost, because that is what being human is all about. She stood and took another book from a nearby shelf. More children are waiting for stories. Will you read with me? You do the funny voices so well. A smile touched Arthur's lips as he took the book from her. It would be my honor. They sat and read in a quiet corner of the foundation that bore his mother's name. It was built with the fortune from his father's dark enterprise, now serving a community that had been taught fear but was learning hope. Outside, the dark car finally drove away from the curb. Inside, children's laughter filled the air as they ate, feeling secure for the first time in their young lives. And inside her pocket, Lillian carried a $5 bill. It was proof that the smallest kindness could halt the most powerful men, could bend a path of violence towards something like grace. It showed that in a cruel world, goodness still had power. It still spread, and it still saved people. One choice at a time. This story carries a simple but powerful truth. Kindness is never wasted. A 9-year-old girl with nothing but $5 proved that generosity is not about what you have, it is about who you are. She reminded us that in a world full of people looking away, the ones who stop and help are the ones who change everything. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done with that $5? And if you have not subscribed yet, join this family so you never miss a story that matters. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon right now. I have another incredible story waiting for you. Click on the next video and let us continue this journey together. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and heartfelt stories to our audience.